The British Parliament resumes one day after the Supreme Court ruled its suspension was illegal. The Attorney General defends the legal advice he gave the government and says there will be another attempt to push through a general election later today. In the US, Democrats launched an impeachment inquiry into President Trump over claims he pressured the president of Ukraine to investigate his potential 2020 rival Joe Biden. Trump denies the allegations. And Ukraine's President Zelensky among those speaking on day 2 of the UN General Assembly in New York. Iran's President Hassan Rouhani also set to take to the podium amid rising tensions in the Persian Gulf. Those are the headlines this hour. You're watching France 24. British lawmakers have returned to Parliament one day after the Supreme Court ruled its suspension was illegal. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is expected to make a statement on that decision later today. He returned early from the UN General Assembly in New York. So far, he's dismissed calls from opposition leaders for him to resign. Here's the UK Attorney General, Geoffrey Cox, defending the legal advice he gave Johnson's government over prorogation.
The government accepts the judgment and accepts that it lost the case. And at all times, the government acted in good faith and in the belief that its approach was both lawful and constitutional. But we were disappointed that in the end the Supreme Court took a different view. And of course, we respect the judgment of the court.
Well, France 24's Benedict Pavio is in London with more on today's events at Westminster.
Attorney General Geoffrey Cox, a very combative, really contribution there, started seemingly, well, certainly no apology, but certainly this, of course, has changed everything, and that is the Supreme Court judgment that, despite the advice of the Attorney General, the government lost comprehensively. Let's remember when all 11 justices, all 11 judges decided unanimously that the prorogation, 5-week prorogation, suspension of Parliament was unlawful. Therefore, it never happened, and that is why Parliament is resuming today. Now, what was interesting and important in what is one of 2 urgent questions that has been chosen by the Speaker, 32, I understand, were submitted. That is to give you an idea of how fired up the MPs are here, given the situation the United Kingdom finds itself in, 36 days away from the 31st of October, and that deal or no deal with the 27 other EU countries. It was a question, an urgent question from the SNP, Scottish National Party Justice spokesperson, Joanna Sherry, who, of course, also was involved in the Supreme Court appeal. But her question specifically was, will the Attorney General publish the legal advice that was given to Her Majesty the Queen by her Prime Minister, Boris Johnson? And the result of that is that the Attorney General has said repeatedly that he will consider the matter. So no clarification for the moment whether we will see that legal advice.
Now, Wednesday, of course, is traditionally PMQs, Prime Minister's questions. I understand that is not happening because Boris Johnson, of course, did not think he was going to be in Parliament today. But we should be getting a statement from him later. Is that right?
That's exactly right, Laura. So what we've got is these 2 urgent questions, and then we've got 5 ministerial statements, because, of course, Parliament has been suspended and unable to work, and a lot of things have happened. So one will, of course, be of interest to many people around the world. It will be about an update about Thomas Cook. Another will also be important. The Foreign Secretary himself, Dominic Raab, will be at the dispatch box to answer questions, make a statement on Iran. So that will be another one to watch. There will be another one on no-deal preparation of the United Kingdom for Brexit. But of course, the one that trumps it all, so to speak, will be when Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, having hot-footed it and shortened his visit in New York at the UN General Assembly, will come to a very fired up, we think around about 5 p.m. Paris time, So I invite all our viewers to watch out for that, because, of course, there are, since yesterday and that Supreme Court, unprecedented, unanimous, seismic in legal and political, constitutional consequences Supreme Court ruling. There are really very many calls, certainly of all the main opposition leaders, for Boris Johnson not just to consider his position, but actually to resign. So it will be, but of course we've seen a very fired up, also combative Boris Johnson, who, although he hasn't given interviews, has given some very quick sound bites on the hoof in New York, and he is clearly in no mood either. And he wants a general election. And I think I then just going to refer for a few seconds back to the Attorney General. The Attorney General actually has taken on fully Parliament. He has just called it, in incredible scenes in the House of Commons, he said that this is a dead Parliament, that these turkeys will have to vote eventually for Christmas, that they are cowardly, and he said, you know, bring it on, bring on a general election, but basically you're too cowardly to do so. You are dead, you have no moral right to be sitting here on these benches anymore. So very combative government coming out today in Parliament, and we will see that statement later on. And of course he'll have to answer very many questions, the Prime Minister himself, Boris Johnson.
Benedict Pavio there. Now moving to another major political row, this time in the United States, where Democratic House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has launched a formal impeachment inquiry against President Trump over a phone call he made to the president of Ukraine. Trump's admitted speaking to Volodymyr Zelensky about his potential 2020 rival, the former Vice President Joe Biden, but denies putting pressure on him to investigate Biden. Trump calls the whole thing a witch hunt, but Pelosi says Trump has breached his constitutional responsibilities and must be held accountable. So could Trump be the fourth US president to be impeached? Erin Agunke takes us through what happens now.
For the founding fathers of the United States, protection against the abuse of executive power was so important they wrote it into the Constitution before they even defined the contours of the presidency. Their solution, impeachment, which is an official statement of charges triggering a trial against any civil officer, including the president. Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution lays out the grounds for impeachment: treason and bribery, as well as any other high crimes and misdemeanors. The offense does not necessarily have to be a crime. Any grave act or pattern of unethical behavior could suffice. The process starts with an investigation, historically led by the House Judiciary Committee. The lawmakers first debate and lay out the grounds for impeachment, followed by a vote on the charges. And if the articles of impeachment are approved by a simple majority in the House, they then move on to the Senate for trial. If at least 2/3 of the senators find the president guilty, he or she is removed from office without the possibility of an appeal. In this case, the vice president would take over as president. Currently, Democrats hold a 235 to 198 majority over Republicans in the House, but their advantage ends there. In the Senate, Republicans hold a 53 to 45 majority with 2 independents. To obtain the supermajority required to successfully remove the president, 20 Republican senators would have to turn on Donald Trump. And if history is any indicator for how impeachment proceedings against President Trump may turn out, they are unlikely to bring about his removal. The House of Representatives has only passed the articles of impeachment twice in U.S. history. Once against Andrew Johnson in 1868, and a second time against Bill Clinton in 1998. In both cases, the presidents were acquitted by the Senate.
Well, it's against that backdrop that Ukraine's president will be making his first speech to the UN General Assembly later today. Iran's President Hassan Rouhani will also take to the podium on this, the second day of the UN General Assembly. Despite efforts by the French President Emmanuel Macron, Rouhani will not be meeting Donald Trump, who yesterday pledged to impose even tougher sanctions on Tehran. James Fazina tells us what to expect.
After separate talks with the US and Iranian presidents, Emmanuel Macron is still pushing for Donald Trump and Hassan Rouhani to shake hands.
I think that if confidence is regained on both sides, then we can move forward and make this happen. I think that the lifting of sanctions by the Americans without any movement on the other issues is not feasible, just as clear commitments by Iran on the issues I've mentioned is not feasible without American commitments.
Over the course of the past days, the French president, backed by Germany and the UK, has been calling on both leaders to renew talks over Iran's nuclear deal. But in his address to the United Nations General Assembly, Donald Trump was eager to remind his counterparts that Iran remains a security threat.
Thank you very much. As long as Iran's menacing behavior continues, sanctions will not be lifted. They will be tightened.
Just last week, Trump announced what he called the toughest sanctions ever on Iran. But renewed talks between the heads of states would only work as a two-way deal, as Rouhani made clear he would only sit down at the negotiating table if the economic sanctions are lifted.
We must create mutual trust. And the trust is something that Mr. Trump took away from this framework. We had an agreement. Mr. Trump exited without a valid justification and illegally.
More details of Rouhani's plans will be made clearer this Wednesday as he takes to the stage to address the UN General Assembly.
Now, the UN panel on climate change says global sea levels are now rising 2.5 times faster than during the last century, posing a grave threat to humanity. It's the first report which specifically addresses the impacts of global warming on Earth's oceans and frozen regions and comes 2 days after a climate summit in New York. Yuka Roy reports.
By soaking up a quarter of man-made carbon dioxide and 90% of the heat generated by greenhouse gases, the ocean has kept our planet livable, but it's approaching breaking point.
The ocean has been acting like a sponge, absorbing carbon dioxide and heat to regulate the temperature. But it can't keep up.
The new UN report, based on the work of 104 scientists from 36 countries, paints a grim picture about what's happening to global seas and ice.
During the 20th century, the global mean sea level rose by about 15 centimeters. It's currently rising more than twice as fast, and the pace will further accelerate, reaching up to 1.10 meters in 2100 in projections, if emissions are not sharply reduced.
Even if greenhouse gas emissions are curbed, many serious impacts are already inevitable, according to the 900-page assessment. The UN warns that by mid-century, low-lying coastal cities and small islands will be exposed to risks of flooding and land loss every year. Hurricanes and El Niños will likely get more severe due to weaker ocean currents, melting glaciers, and reduced permafrost. Rising sea levels would mean many fish and other animal species could disappear. Like 3 previous UN climate reports released this year, the document concludes that humanity must change the way it produces and uses energy.
Now, the fallout from the collapse of Thomas Cook continues. Thousands of British holidaymakers are being flown home in the biggest ever peacetime repatriation, and tourism industries across the world are feeling the impact of the demise of what was the world's oldest travel agency. Selena Sykes has more.
Days after the collapse of Thomas Cook, the fallout continues. As thousands of employees and suppliers face uncertain futures, the knock-on effects of the demise of the world's oldest travel agency are being felt by tourism industries across the world, including in Spain, Greece, Tunisia and Turkey. Dalaman Airport in southwest Turkey is to lose 70,000 Thomas Cook passengers who were supposed to travel in October.
Thomas Cook normally brings 400,000 British tourists to the region. The fact that 70,000 passengers won't be coming here will cause economic problems. This will affect not only our airports, but it will also affect our tourism partners in the region.
As thousands of British holidaymakers continue to fly home in the biggest ever peacetime repatriation, the UK government has already announced an urgent inquiry into Thomas Cook's collapse by the Insolvency Service. The Financial Reporting Council is also considering an investigation into how the company was run and why warning signs about its financial health were ignored. Prime Minister Boris Johnson and leader of the opposition Jeremy Corbyn have also raised questions about how much Thomas Cook bosses were paid, even as finances ran dry.
Bosses were able to fill their pockets with unearned bonuses while their workers face redundancy, and 150,000 holidaymakers are stranded because of their failure.
Top directors at Thomas Cook have been paid nearly €23 million in salaries and bonuses since 2014.
Well, that brings us up to date with the international news this hour. Do stay with us, much more still to come here on France 24.
On July 23, 2018, the Atapo Dam in Laos collapsed.
That dam up there was a curse. There's death, poverty, hunger all around us.
My rice paddy, my money, everything was taken away.
No one is allowed to talk about the tragedy. The government continues its relentless sale of Laos' natural resources.
No one dares speak.
There'll be nothing to grow and nothing left to fish in the rivers for the next generations. Instead, there'll be only foreign investors.
Watch our investigation into a tragedy foretold.
Reporters, presented by Mark Owen on France 24 and France24.com.